lot of sexual attraction is sort of trying to reach out and grasp what you feel like you lack, you know.
I remember myself, like I just saw myself as this category, like this is who I am, that's it, period, you know, I'm a gay man. That's not who I was.
The question of identity is also necessarily taken up with questions of relationship. We can't, in a sense, think about ourselves and who we are, except to some degree in relationship to others.
Each of us comes into the world created to be with others. It is a fundamental fact, a beautiful treasure of the human experience. By ourselves, we are blessedly incomplete. We want to love and be loved. We desire relationships, friendships, and bonds of love with others. We want to know others, and we want them to know us, personally and intimately. To best fulfill this desire for relationship, we seek to serve others and to authentically share our hearts with them. The best example of this is Jesus Christ, who, as Scripture says, came not to be served, but to serve. Only through this self-giving can we come to fully understand who we are and discover the fulfillment that each of us seeks. Without being in a self-forgetting, self-giving relationship with others, we are not who we were created to be. Through His actions and words, which have been recorded in sacred Scripture, Christ reveals to all of us not only who He is, but who we are meant to be. Yes, He is God, but we also believe Jesus Christ is fully human. He is like us in all things but sin. By His life and identity, Jesus shows us the divine blueprint and model for our identity as children of God. The first program in this series explored one aspect of sexuality through stories of people like me, people with a same-sex attraction. These stories included transformations of mind and heart, which in turn led to a change of behavior and identity. Embracing chastity, something we are all called to do, led to interior peace, joy, and fulfillment. In part 2, we continue our discussion about the Catholic Church, sex and homosexuality, by taking a closer look at what might be called our design for sex. Understanding our sexual design and its essential connection to love helps clear up the confusion and reveals the mystery about who we are as persons. Some think this is only a religious question, but it's first and foremost a human question, a question that applies to all of us, no matter our religious beliefs.
What is sex for? This is a simple question, yet today it's often met with a variety of conflicting answers. Though this is being challenged today, the common understanding of sexuality is that we humans have been created in exactly two complementary kinds, male and female. So sexuality is a big part of our life. The Catechism of the Catholic Church says it like this: sexuality affects all aspects of the human person in the unity of his body and soul. Put another way, sexuality helps us understand who we are as individual people and as members of the human race. Understanding sexuality helps avoid unrest and even pain in our lives. In a positive way, understanding our sexuality helps lead us to fulfillment.
I think the most important question ever asked in human history was posed by Jesus Christ to His disciples when He said, "Who do you say that I am?" That question of identity is central to our understanding of why we are here, how we should live, what is a good life, and in fact, what is human happiness and joy. But foundational is the question of identity. Who am I? So when Christ poses this question to the apostles, He's beginning at the beginning. And before we can know how it is that we are to live in the world, the question of identity must first be addressed. We call the church our mother. That's another question of identity. And Catholics are very at ease with that because it's such a human idea to think about the Church as a person. And we do think of the Church as a person, the bride of Christ. And so there is the feminine character of the Church. And to think of the Church as our mother helps us considerably, especially in difficult questions. So our mother, the Church, is very careful when she distinguishes questions of identity from questions related to interest and inclination, and then from questions of activity. So the first and most important thing we can say about who we are is that we are God's children, and we are created in His image and likeness. And we know this from the story of creation, that God has given us life, and that life itself is reflective of God's own divine life, the Trinitarian life, 3 persons in one God.
3 persons in one God, the Trinity. We always think of one person of the Blessed Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in relationship to the other 2. What does all this have to do with sex? In a surprising way, quite a lot. If we are created in God's image and likeness, then how is this expressed in humanity? Through our human sexuality, male and female, one created for the other. Without each other, man or woman, indeed humanity, is incomplete. If one sex were taken away, humanity would no longer reveal the image and likeness of God. Remember from the creation story that not only are we created male and female, but also that God calls upon us to be fruitful and multiply in the covenant of marriage. This is our nature, our design, male and female, made for union with the other. That gives us our sexual identity. This is why there is sex. We have a design, but we also have freedom. When we choose in harmony with that design, it leads to fulfillment and peace. But what happens when we use our freedom contrary to the design? We come into collision with ourselves. We are at cross purposes with our own nature, and in some way we will know it and feel it.
What we're designed for, we are made with a view to marriage and family, and sexuality is connected with that.
Dr. Jay Budziszewski is an author, philosopher, teacher, and convert to the Catholic faith. As a longtime university professor of government and philosophy, he gets an up-close look at sexual confusion among today's college students. While baby boomers of the 60s and 70s embraced the idea of free love, today we see the momentum they began continue to erode the boundaries of morality and sexuality in even greater measure. Generation Y, the millennial generation, are children of a new sexual revolution. What the professor sees and hears from students on campus is often disturbing.
People talk about the consequences of the sexual revolution and they say, well, it doesn't hurt anybody. Man, how could you say that? Look around. You know, somebody wakes up in the middle of the night and he's thinking about how he's going to talk his girlfriend into having an abortion. We find an alarming and unusual rise in the rate of adolescent girls cutting themselves with razors. Now that's a very strange thing. Why would they be doing that? I think that this is connected with self-loathing and self-punishment. Why would they be punishing themselves? We have to ask questions.
Dr. Budziszewski finds himself constantly bombarded by questions about the meaning and purpose of sex. Is sex, they ask, simply about pleasure? Part of the answer is revealed through other designs and functions of the body.
What's the purpose of the, let's say, the power to ingest food? And they'll say nutrition. It's to nourish us. Sure. What's the purpose of the power to take in air? Well, to oxygenate the blood. You know, you need that. Right. What's the purpose of stretching your muscle? You know, well, you're squeezing all the toxins out. What's the purpose of... Notice they're not saying the purpose is pleasure of any of these things. But every one of them is pleasurable. Taking a deep breath is pleasurable. Stretching your limbs is pleasurable. They're all pleasurable, but people immediately see, but pleasure isn't the purpose. You could get the pleasure of stretching your limbs, whether you're exercising or yawning, or whether you're kicking somebody. Right? And one of those ways of getting the pleasure is right, and one of them is wrong. So reasoning in the same way, what's the purpose of the sexual powers? Now people will say, I get it. Procreation, they'll say. That'll be the first thing that they say.
But having babies isn't the only reason or purpose of sex, is it? No, that's not what Catholics believe anyway. The Catechism teaches us that sexuality is not something simply biological, but concerns the innermost being of the human person. The innermost being of the human person. This is what a man and woman in marriage give to each other. They give the gift of their very selves. Our friend Dr. Budajewski has a way of expressing this unique design of man and woman and how they are made for each other on many levels, not just sexually. He says that apart from each other, they are blessedly incomplete.
Look, a man like me, and any women who are listening to us will instantly recognize this. There is something missing or deficient in our makeup. There are things that we just don't get very well. And they need to be pointed out to us. We need help from women in order to get this. We need to be balanced by the presence of the other sex, or we're going to be very unbalanced. Now, this doesn't mean everybody has to marry, okay? But it means that everybody has to acknowledge the reality and the importance of the other sex. And the same is true for women.
So blessedly incomplete, every person is made for relationships. Every person is made for trust. Every person is made for friendship. Every person is made for love. And there is a very particular expression of these things called spousal love, which is that intimacy between man and woman in which the two become one physically, emotionally, psychologically, and in the partnership of whole life, which is the joining of two now that something new is created, which is the marriage. And one component, of course, of that communion, of that unity of life, is sexual intimacy. But the Church, in reflecting on God's command to be fruitful and multiply, never loses sight that sexual intimacy and fruitfulness or fertility are always together. Now, the question about how homosexuality is related to that, I think, is in this sense really very simple. Once we separate or try to separate fertility from sex, then unfortunately we open the door to a number of different things which will only do harm to those who are involved, because it means that they will not be acting in a way consistent with the gift that they have received. It may be a little bit more difficult today, especially in a more sexually promiscuous environment, to see that the gift is being abused. But with some reflection, I think we can understand it. And that is why in the Sixth Commandment, or the Church's teaching of the Sixth Commandment, she's very careful to say, here are a number of things which will cause you to betray the gift and in some way tarnish that image of God within you. Masturbation, pornography, cohabitation, fornication, adultery, any form of lust, and homosexual behavior. I didn't say the inclination, but behavior, and contraception.
Contraception? What does the birth control pill have to do with homosexuality? Again, there is a surprising connection, or at least one most people don't think about. It is an example of how people in our culture have misused, or at least misunderstood, sex.
Introduced in the early 1960s, the birth control pill helped ignite a sexual, spiritual, and moral revolution unlike any other. For the first time in human history, the deliberate disconnect between sex and children became mainstream behavior for an entire generation. The proliferation of birth control pill use by millions of women was soon followed by other practices, including surgical sterilization, artificial barrier methods like the IUD and condoms, and a variety of anti-fertility chemicals. It was a radical change in thinking and living that dramatically transformed the culture.
It was a decisive point. It was a point from that moment on, it made it more difficult to teach people that the loving intimacy of the sexual bond between the spouses is connected with the inbuilt meaning of openness to new life. You know, it became much more difficult. You could still talk about love, but you couldn't talk about having children, about making families, and that impoverished your very idea of love. Because love wants to give, and you're saying, yeah, but I don't want to give that much.
All of us need balance in our lives, no matter who we are, no matter what our sexual attraction. We've already seen our natural design of sexuality, man and woman complementing each other. In the Catechism, we learn that this balance is obtained when we accept our sexual identity solely as male or female, which was given us by God. This identity includes not only the physical uniqueness of the two sexes, but also the emotional and the spiritual differences between them. They are truly complementary. So when there is a departure from this thinking, as in the case of same-sex attraction, the Church has a term for it. It's called objectively disordered. That can sound cruel and insensitive, especially to someone like me. But it is important to know that this is not saying I or anyone else is disordered, only the sexual attraction. This may be the way I feel, but this is not who I am.
Now those words fall very hard on a lot of ears, because it can sound as though the person is objectively disordered. But the Church is very careful in her distinctions. She's not talking about a person at that point. She's talking about a desire, an inclination that is misdirected, and misdirected in a way that will betray the good that the person really desires, human intimacy and love. Now, we have to make a careful distinction here, because the homosexual inclination, the same-sex attraction, can never be fulfilled in a way consistent with the gift of our humanity. And that is why the Church describes it as objectively disordered. It means it is out of sync with, out of harmony with, the gift of our humanity. It doesn't mean the person is out of harmony. It means the inclination, the desire, is not in harmony, out of sync with. The Church is careful to distinguish three things whenever she speaks about homosexuality: the person, the inclination, and the action. The person we have spoken about at some length, created in the image and likeness of God, redeemed by the precious blood of Christ, invited to grace in this life and glory in the life to come. Always good, no matter what they are doing or have done. Then there is the action itself, unchaste behavior. We've talked about many different kinds of unchaste behavior according to the Sixth Commandment, but in this case we're talking about homosexual activity is gravely contrary to the human good. And then there is that middle piece there, the homosexual inclination, or the same-sex attraction, or the erotic attraction to members of the same sex.
It's not always easy to communicate, and some people, don't want to hear it. Don't want to hear that there's a distinction, that there is almost a gay mantra that I am what I do. Well, that's simply not true, and I am not what I want to do. Even I am what I am. I'm a child of God.
I remember saying to myself, even right in a very, very basic, how much more sex can I have with people? Like nothing meant anything anymore. I guess I was looking for a knight in shining armor. Anytime I slept with somebody, you're thinking that they're the one, and we're not made that way, and so I was sleeping left, right, and center with people, and I'm getting high left, right, and center all over the place, but none of that works.
We're not made that way. Sexuality is, we're designed so that sexuality builds a bond. It's supposed to do that. And so when you pretend that it's not for that, and when you keep joining and tearing away, and joining and tearing away, and joining and tearing away, for a while you have an awful lot of pain, and then you have an awful lot of scar tissue. People lose the very capacity for romantic intimacy. They think, well, it can mean nothing now, but I can make it mean something when I want it to. Well, what you're saying there is that it does mean something. It means that it's a tool. It means that it's a light switch I can turn on when I want to give myself certain feelings of meaning. And that's not its meaning.
When we talk about our design, including our design of sexuality, we are talking about the bedrock of moral thinking that predates Christianity. It's called natural law. Ancient philosophers like Plato and Aristotle spoke of moral laws that are built right into our nature. These laws don't need to be proven. They are evident in themselves. These secular thinkers with no connection to Christianity knew that there is a moral design, a natural law about who we are and about right and wrong.
There is a twofold universal experience of morality that everyone shares. The first is commonly called the natural moral law. The Catechism of the Catholic Church states that the natural law is written and engraved in the soul of each and every man, and that it is nothing other than the light of understanding placed in us by God. Through it, we know what we must do and what we must avoid. The second aspect of this twofold experience is what the Church calls concupiscence. Due to original sin, our human nature has been weakened of its power to choose the good and avoid evil. In his dialogue Phaedrus, Plato uses the image of two horses bound to the same chariot, but pulling at opposite directions, to describe this moral tension.
St. Paul wrote about this inner struggle in his letter to the Romans, telling them, "For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do. This I keep on doing." Later, the great doctor of the Church, St. Thomas Aquinas, used the idea of natural law to help Christians of his day better appreciate right from wrong.
Natural law means the laws of our nature. Now, if you think that nature just means stuff, material, you would say, what do you mean laws of nature? You mean like gravity? No, we're talking about moral laws. We're talking not about the laws of what will happen. You drop a rock in a gravitational field and it goes down. We're talking about the laws of what needs to happen for beings made as we are made to be fulfilled. For instance, you should not gratuitously harm your neighbor. Equals should be treated equally in the relevant respects. Good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. Now you can't prove those things, but you don't need to, because they're evident in themselves. Okay, and so this is deeply built into the human moral intellect. We have a design. I was talking about design before. The designedness of things, even before you know any details about how we're designed, the sheer recognition that we are designed tells you something about right and wrong, because it starts drawing your attention to the designer. It starts making you ask questions about him. It means, if you take it seriously, that means the way that I am is not an accident. I'm not just a meaningless and purposeless result of a process that did not have me in mind. There is an illusion out there. Not everyone has this illusion, but many people think that sex is just a source of so much trouble, and if only I can make it meaningless, it won't be a problem. If only I can make it empty, it won't be a problem. That's the origin of the whole hooking up culture, you know. You might not even know the name of the person that you sleep with. You might be connected with them for only 15 minutes or only one night. And even after one night, you still don't know the guy's name.
We are designed for intimacy, bonding, and complementarity. The Catechism states everyone, man and woman, should acknowledge and accept his or her sexual identity. Physical, emotional, spiritual differences and complementarity are oriented toward what the Catechism calls the goods of marriage, that is, the flourishing of family life. When we try to avoid these dynamics in establishing sexual relationships, we become, as we said earlier, at cross purposes with ourselves and come into collision with our human nature. For the person with a same-sex attraction, intimacy, relationship, and community comes through our practice of the virtue of chastity.
I remember myself, like I just saw myself as this category, like this is who I am, that's it, period, you know, I'm a gay man. That's not who I was. I mean, that's, you know, okay, maybe I had those things, maybe I did that, but you know, that was such a minor part of who I was. That was such an unimportant part of who I was. I was so much more than that.
This is what Pope Benedict, then Cardinal Ratzinger, was saying in a letter to the bishops of the Church in 1986. He states, "The human person, made in the image and likeness of God, can hardly be adequately described by a reductionist reference to his or her sexual orientation. This is why identifying ourselves as gay or homosexual is an injustice to those of us with a same-sex attraction. We're more than that."
I don't want to minimize the difficulty here, because the desire for intimacy and love is something that's foundational in us, strong in us. In fact, those desires to love and be loved are stronger than the desires for food and drink. It's not that our Lord doesn't want to unite people. It's that he wants to unite them in the truth. He wants to unite them in authentic love, which is guided by the truth of who God is and who we are. And because we are sinful, because we are weak, there are going to be occasions when we choose something contrary to the truth. But the Church in her charity and following the example of Jesus says, these are things that will get you into difficulty. So please avoid them. And then the Church also gives us the means and the tools, the grace, the teaching, the fellowship, the accountability, the encouragement, the practical example, as well as all of the gifts of the sacramental economy, the sacramental life, to help someone to work against the weakness and to receive that grace that will allow them to follow Christ more authentically.
Courage is a Roman Catholic apostolate helping men and women experiencing same-sex attractions to achieve peace of mind and heart and authentic relationships with God, themselves, and others. Support, resources, and people who care are available at couragerc.org and by calling 203-803-1564.